Welcome to the July edition, 2024, of the Friends of Candelaria Nature Preserves monthly speaker series. Today, I'm Katie Stone, and I have taken on managing this series. And today we've invited Missy Bacigalupa, and hopefully I've said your name right. Missy manages the day-to-day activities at the Sevilleta Long-Term Ecological Research Program. That includes data collection and analysis. She does experimental design and application, and she's a liaison and planner and does all kinds of stuff with permitting and implementation of research project between the team, students, and volunteers. She has working with her over 70 PhD level researchers, the US Fish and Wildlife Service as well. And she started her career at UNM as a research assistant nearly a decade ago. So I want to welcome you, Missy. First of all, it might help for some of us who don't know or who are watching this video on YouTube, who are not from around here. Where is the Sevilleta Wildlife Reserve? And
Well,
welcome.
thank you. Yeah, that was a great introduction. Thank you. So actually, that is one of my concurrent slides, so I can just jump to it right now. The Sevilleta Wildlife Refuge is the largest in the state. It is located between Albuquerque and Socorro. So it's about 45 minutes south of Albuquerque and 15 minutes north of Socorro. And this refuge is 250,000 acres. So it's it's a very large chunk of land down here. If you've ever driven through this area, if you're headed south, you look to the right and you can see Ladrone Peak. And that's this area in the upper left of the refuge. And then if you look left, you can see Los Pinos Mountains. And that's over here on the east side of the refuge. And so all of the refuge is between those two sets of mountains, and it's a very large section of the state. So the reason that this makes a really great place for us to study is because it's right at the confluence of Great Plains grassland, which constitutes the northeast part of the state, Chihuahuan Desert grassland, which is a large part of the southern part of the state, and then Chihuahuan Desert shrubland, which is sort of core Chihuahuan Desert that sort of comes after Chihuahuan Desert grassland in terms of succession. And then as well, we have the mountains here, Los Pinos, which give us a glimpse into juniper savanna and pinon juniper woodland. So among these, as well as the riparian area in the middle, we cover a large number of the really classic ecosystems of New Mexico. And I think that everybody who's driven through the state has seen all of these ecosystems. So it's really a fantastic place to study. We do work with the Fish and Wildlife Service. The land is owned by Fish and Wildlife, but research was built into the original intention of the refuge, which is completely rare on a national scale. It's not a common collaboration between a university and a wildlife refuge. And so it's very rare for people to be able to research what undisturbed, ungrazed, undeveloped land looks like on this large of a scale. So as Katie mentioned, we have a large program. There are over 70 PhD level drylands researchers who work with us, and these people are coming from all over the world. We work with people from the University of Exeter. We have Brazilian researchers that we've worked with, and then among the prestigious universities in the US, we work with Rice University, Berkeley, NAU for example, there's a lot of researchers that are part of our program throughout the country. So we're based at the University of New Mexico, which is an R1 institution. This is a designation that refers to a PhD level institution that conducts a high level of research. It's a very prestigious designation, and we're the only university in New Mexico to hold this designation. We do work with fish and wildlife, which I have already covered. All of our work is permitted. We're doing our best to not disturb the ecosystem while we're working with it, which becomes important when you see the kind of experiments that we're working with, because restoration ends up being an important part of our presence on that landscape. So our funding does come from the National Science Foundation. We're part of the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, which is a national network that is funded by the federal government in order to inventory our national ecological resources and determine what kind of ecological relationships are happening there. So our focus is on long-term ecological studies and on landscape scale research. We do have physiological biology, chemical biology. We have several hydrology studies that are going on. But the main focus is on pulling together what these different plants, animals, bugs, with the climate, how everything is interacting with each other, so that we can communicate with these other stations in this network in order to get a better idea across the US of what's happening. So as part of this network, all of our data sets are publicly available. And this link here, this is the EDI repository. So anyone can access these and work with our data sets at any given point. And it's great because sometimes we'll have people contact us completely out of the blue that we don't even know, that say, hey, we used your data in our nationwide research study. So just wanted to let you know, which is great. So I've covered where we're located on the refuge here between Albuquerque and Socorro. I would like to cover a good deal of the research that we do here. So if anything that I'm sort of glossing over needs more explanation, please interrupt me. Please let me know if there's anything that I can do to clarify. There's a lot of research, and so it's sort of hard to like step back from the academic side of things and come to broad conclusions. So if I'm getting a little pedantic, please step in and help me be more relatable. So as I mentioned, we were written into the warranty deed at the Sevilleta Wildlife Refuge. And so what that means is that we started researching 16 years after the refuge was founded in 1989. Our research consists of long-term monitoring, which is just observing what's happening in the natural ecosystem. And then we also conduct certain experiments to simulate expected future conditions, or to simulate conditions that are happening elsewhere in the country. And then we have mathematical models that we use to sort of pull everything together in order to make predictions and broad generalizations about what's happening on the landscape. So this is a little bit of bragging rights here, but our program has over 1,000 published articles. And the main topics of these articles are ecosystem transitions, climate change sensitivity in ecosystems, processes involving biological processes, geological processes, and chemical processes all together. Consumer dynamics, meaning anything that is higher than a plant on the trophic level. So insects, we do a lot of work with mammals. There's a few larger mammals on the refuge that we've also done work with, which include American pronghorn and oryx. And then disturbance impacts are a big part of our research as well, namely in the experimental side. So then in addition, I've mentioned that we have this EDI repository where we are required to publish our data. And so within that repository, we have 225 published data sets as of 2023. And we added a couple this year, so it might be more like 230, 235. Among these data sets, we have meteorological data. So we've been collecting climate data since 1988 across the refuge. I'll cover that in a minute. We've also collected plant biomass and cover by species. So biomass is sort of the industry standard for determining both what individual species are doing across a landscape, as well as landscape scale carbon fixation. So biomass just refers to the total dry weight of plants that are in the ecosystem, from which we can determine the carbon that they've fixed, and then we can also use it as a proxy for the abundance of that species. So this has been our most popular data set by far, is this plant biomass. And then the cover is just percent cover within 1 by 1 meter sampling units, which I'll cover in a minute. We have a plant traits database, which covers leaf succulence and leaf area and stem thickness and all of the kinds of things that you would expect to be adaptive in one setting or another for a plant. And so we can monitor, as we see changes in this plant biomass and cover data set, we can monitor which plants are doing better based on their traits. We also collect plant phenology. This is simply the timing of different phases in a plant's life. I'll cover more. And then we have several published species lists, which I think might be relevant to Candelaria, because I'm sure we have plenty of species in common, especially in the uplands areas. Vegetation line intercept, I'm not really going to cover today, but this essentially is an inventory of the plants on the landscape that would be very easy for you to do, where you can go from one point to another. It's especially valuable along a gradient. You just go along the transect and identify what's there and what space it's occupying. So we also have, oh no, shoot. We also have bee monitoring, grasshopper monitoring, and small mammal mark recapture monitoring. So I mentioned our MET data. This is our longest running data set. It's gone since 1988. All of these points here on the map represent a meteorological station. So we're covering all of our ecosystems here, all of the mountain systems, the grassland systems, the shrublands. This is down in the south, we have like shrubland system. And at each of these sites, we're collecting soil moisture, rainfall, wind speed, wind direction, incoming photosynthetic active radiation, temperature, and air humidity. So, oh, that's too bad. I had written the takeaways. What we found from our metadata through time has been that yes, it's getting hotter, it's getting drier. We're seeing less of these wet and cool years in grasslands and shrublands, and sort of continuation of historical conditions in the areas that are closer to the mountains. So uh that's really a bummer. We had also a nitrogen deposition experiment where we were collecting nitrogen that was coming out of the atmosphere into these bottles, and then we would measure the amount of nitrogen, and we found that that was more uneven than we thought across the landscape. So one of the big predictions for the future is that there will likely be a lot of nitrogen deposition from the atmosphere. And I think in a lot of models that's seen as a blanket increase across all systems, across all areas. But what we found was that it was not blanket and that it was uneven in the areas that we looked at. So it's worth thinking about. We didn't conclude the reason as to why the deposition was different in different areas.
Why do we care? I mean, not to sound, but like when you're talking about nitrogen deposition, you're depositing nitrogen from the atmosphere. It's like landing on the planet just organically. And does it fix into the soil in the way that like legumes would fix nitrogen?
So the nitrogen that's coming into these systems from the atmosphere is like what we would think of as acid rain, for example, or
So it's
overflow.
like poison. It's really pollution.
In a sense, in a sense, yeah, there are effects that we could see as benefits from this, but there's also downsides. And I do have a section here. So just from our metadata, we can't come to conclusions about the effects of nitrogen deposition. We can only monitor where it's happening. But we do have a nitrogen deposition experiment. So I'm glad that you asked, because we do have results from that deposition experiment later in the presentation. Thank you. That's a good question.
Peter
So,
has in the chat a question that maybe we should
oh,
save, but maybe we could just bring it up so that we can fantasize in our minds if this is even possible at our own place. He's asking if it's,
yeah.
yeah, if it's federally funded. I guess I'll say this just for folks who might need it to be spoken aloud. Would the long-term ecological research be something that could be set up at Candelaria Nature Preserve? You mentioned it's federally funded. Does that matter if the property is city owned?
I think that for monitoring Candelaria, specifically monitoring your improvement projects and your preservation projects, an LTER would be way overkill, honestly. um, because it's just a lot of grant writing and a lot of collaboration between different researchers. I do think that many of the protocols that I'm describing today could be applicable to Candelaria. Uh, Probably not in LTER in and of itself, because it's just a huge organization that requires to be tied to a university, and there's a lot of funding requirements and uh, things of that nature. I do like the question though. I would love to do research at Candelaria.
Well, if we ever fit into your plans, obviously we're amenable to the idea.
That's great. We're working on expanding more into riparian areas. And we do have riparian experts who are on board with the LTER right now who would be interested. We're trying to model ecosystem transition in the bosque ecosystem. And so this would be a really cool crossover if we were able to connect those researchers with your program. Awesome. Cool. Thank you for the question, Peter. So we do conduct plant monitoring. This would be useful for measuring changes in plant cover. This would be something that you could utilize at Candelaria. So what we do is we'll put down these 1 by 1 meter quadrats, we call them, and then they're split into a percent system. So it's a 10 by 10 grid. And we determine what the cover of each species of plant is within that grid. We do this for 1,250 unique quadrats twice yearly. And we use this to determine change across the ecosystem. Since we are not in an actively managed ecosystem for the most part, these are largely changes that we're seeing happening naturally in response to either climate change or mostly climate change, honestly. So we have cover and estimated biomass for over 300 plant species. We've also created allometries, which are just equations for converting cover to biomass. As I mentioned, biomass is a very important metric in my line of work. We've also collected plant traits data, which I mentioned before, from 104 species on the refuge. And so we can see these trends happening, and then the plant traits data sort of informs why some species might be doing better than others. So, for example, smaller leaf species do better in dry systems. More succulent leaves do better, like just a thicker leaf as opposed to like a flat broadleaf. We're finding that plants with smaller stature are doing better in droughted experiments. It's been a really great boon to have this plant traits data. So I want to give a shout out to our current field crew. They work very hard to collect all this data. Let's see. So, as I've mentioned, we're witnessing a lot of landscape change. And in our systems, what that means is Great Plains grassland, i.e., blue grama dominated, wetter, cooler grassland is being overtaken by desert grassland, which is dominated by black grama. So why do we care? The blue grama is a more palatable species in general and represents a large part of the state. So if this blue grama grassland is not doing well, it could have serious repercussions for ranching in the state. We're also noticing that desert grassland is turning into shrubland, specifically creosote shrubland. This can be an issue also for ranchers. Woody plants coming into grasslands is a globally recognized phenomenon. And we're just adding into this global wealth of information on what's called shrub encroachment.
But if you want to come and look.
Sorry?
Oh.
Was there a question?
I just think someone was talking. It's okay.
Oh, okay.
They didn't mean to. I think they didn't mean to.
Okay. So then also what we found, this is probably not a surprise to most of us that pinyon juniper woodland is largely turning into juniper savanna due to die-off of the pinon pine. In terms of invasive plants, we found that tumbleweed is most abundant in the black grama dominated grassland, so the Chihuahua Desert grassland, which for whatever reason, tumbleweed just isn't as abundant in either shrubland or in Great Plains grassland. So another thing that we look at for the plants is the timing of their life cycle. So this is sort of a trend that we've seen throughout the country, is people being interested in when things are flowering and fruiting. A common tool for collecting phenology data is Phenology Notebook. It's an online tool, and you can outsource this phenology data collection to people in the community. If you create a phenology trail at the preserve, people can walk along it and do their own data collection, take note of what is fruiting and when, who's putting out leaves and when. So again, why do we care? When new leaves are emerging, this represents basically like the waking up of the system. And so that's the beginning of carbon fixation. It's the beginning of any kind of edible plant part on the landscape for consumers. Obviously, blooms and fruits are important to pollinators as well as consumers. So blooms and pollinators specifically are a hot topic right now. There are a number of different plants that have delayed their blooms in response to changes in climate. And there's a number of plants that have bloomed earlier in the season. Specifically, plants that come up in the fall season are blooming earlier. And so there needs to be an availability of plants that bloom all year long for pollinators to have food, right? So this change in timing can be very important if you're trying to create habitat. And it could be a good benefit to the preserve to just see what's out there currently, how many months of the year food is available to pollinators, how many months of the year food is available in the form of fruits to other consumers, such as small mammals like rodents or, birds. And then senescence is the professional term for the death of a plant. So that marks the end of the season that any sort of food is available in the form of plants. Our takeaways that we found is that in dry years, we're observing earlier flowering and fruiting, specifically in fall. And then a lot of plants just aren't flowering and fruiting in fall due to these hot, dry summers. And so how I would interpret that for your program is that if plants aren't receiving water through the summer, if it's a particularly dry year, they may not be providing the ecosystem services that you're expecting them to in the fall. So if you have a lot of New Mexico olive or a lot of like fruit-bearing trees or plants that you're trying to plant intentionally to attract animals, if it's a dry year, you might not see that happening. So I mentioned pollinators earlier. One thing that we do is we have funnel trap out. It is a passive type of trapping that involves putting out blue plastic funnels that have an agent at the bottom in a can that we use antifreeze. It's a very good preservative, and it's a humane way of killing arthropods. So they'll come into the funnel, they'll go down, they'll think it's a flower, try and get pollen, and then get trapped in the bottom. It sounds kind of brutal, but it's a very important data set for us. It's the longest running bee study in the world. It's been running for 22 years. And we're maintaining every specimen that we collect in the Museum of Southwestern Biology on UNM campus. So everything that goes into these funnels is becoming available to researchers around the world for all future research that they'd be interested in doing in terms of body shape and size, and what are these arthropods eating, and what kind of isotopes do they have in terms of carbon and nitrogen. There's a lot of things that can be done with these specimens, and there is a time component that's important too, because things are changing as we're moving forward. Arthropods are eating from different sources, so being able to go back in time and see what they look like at that point, see what they were eating, see if they were hairy or not, for example, can be very important in the long run of things for research. So at our site, we have found 325 species. This includes first instances of Bombus huntii and Anthophora cinerula. Bombus huntii is an interesting one because it's been observed north of us and southeast of us, but never in the Sevilleta before. Oh, are we monitoring bats? Yeah, I'll cover that in just a minute. We had a question in the chat. So it's very interesting to note that Bombus huntii is between mountain ranges right now, and this is the first instance that anyone's found it here. And so we're wondering, was it always there and we just didn't know, or is it sort of moving into a new territory? And then we found high inter and intra-annual variation, meaning that within a year, each month of the year, there's different bees. And then between years, there's different bees. And it's been interesting to note because it sort of implies that there are different responses to climate, that they're moving to different areas in different climate scenarios. And then we just had a paper published in Nature, woo, Nature, that the main push of that paper was that large bees are more successful in our dry and hot climate and in a more variable climate. So the thought behind that is that these large bees can travel farther looking for food and have more resources just held within their body to be able to weather these hot spells. So the question was, are we monitoring bats? Just recently, it's not part of the LTER, but some other researchers in the state have partnered with Fish and Wildlife Service, and they've put up bat monitoring stations that are sound-based. And so it's sort of just like a little tower that's maybe 10 feet tall, and then it has a recording device on the top. And we can use the sound recording to determine two species, what bats are there and what times they're there. So this year's data is sort of taken as more sort of a trial to see if this is feasible in this landscape, because it's already a little bit late to be monitoring bats in that particular ecosystem. But I think they have 5 or 6 of those recording stations up.
Why is it late? What do you mean by that? Late for what? Like too late in life? There's not enough there anymore. We missed our window when they used to have a lot of bats, or is it just this particular project got set up too late in the year?
Just in the year. It's sort of to see if there are bats there at all right now. And then in the future, they'll be more focused on the spring and early summer period when we would expect to see more bats. It is a good question, though. I like that.
The other
Cool. Thank
little
you.
thing I'm just going to jump in here and say is it's kind of unintuitive that the big bees would survive better because one would have imagined they require more to survive in drier and with less going on. And it just seems like the little bees would fly farther in the wind. And anyway, I'm just going to say, for the record, that's really unintuitive.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. There are kind of mathematical reasons behind that. So as something scales up in 3D, the volume of it increases in 3 dimensions, but the surface area of it only increases in 2 dimensions. And so the larger something is, the higher its surface area to volume ratio will be. And so it becomes more resilient to drying, for example, or to heat. If you were to imagine like a little teaspoon of water in a cold room, it would cool down faster versus a big bucket of water. And the laws of physics are the same for that water to be cooling. It's more just that the surface area that's exposed to the cold air is different, as opposed to the overall body of water that there is. So the bigger the bucket, the smaller the surface exposed to the air is relative to the full volume of the water. And so that's the reason.
What an excellent explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a cool question because, like I said, I forget sometimes what makes sense and what's just crazy university talk. So I'll sort of go kind of quickly through the rest of our ambient monitoring of the natural systems, just so that I can talk a little bit about our experiments. I think that there are really important lessons that we can convey from talking about these experiments. So we do have grasshopper monitoring. This is our longest research. Are next to the meteorological stations. So this has been going on since 1992. It's done by a wonderful member of our community named Dave Lightfoot. He goes out, disturbs the bushes with like a PVC pipe and waits for grasshoppers to come out and then identifies them and counts them. So he walks these transects and just sort of scares out grasshoppers to see what's there. This is totally doable if you have someone who has maybe even like a family level availability, family level skill with identification. Thank you. Andrew put the volume and surface area equation. That's awesome. What a great audience. Thank you. So anyway, what we've noticed over the years is that this abundance is significantly predicted by the climate that year. So how dry it is, how much precipitation is happening, when it's happening. For half of the species on the refuge, which is very interesting because you might sort of expect a trend over time, but from year to year, there's booms and busts, and it very much depends on the climate. Okay, the experiments. So we are very graciously allowed to conduct experiments on this ecosystem. Oh, Astrid is driving past the Sevilleta. That's great. I'm driving past Sevilleta right now on my way home because of this presentation. I'm looking at the refuge in a new light. Oh, that's awesome. I'm so happy. So we're very graciously allowed to conduct these experiments. And our main intention of conducting them is to see how these ecosystems are responding now to these manipulations that are intended to simulate either what we expect to see in New Mexico in the future or conditions that we're already seeing elsewhere in the world. So our mean variance experiment is our flagship experiment. It's very complicated, so I'll try and explain it quickly. We also have an extreme drought in grasslands experiment, which has been running for quite some time, since 2017, 2013. And then we also have a nitrogen fertilizer experiment, which has been happening since 2007. So our mean variance experiment simulates future climate scenarios in order to suss out what ecosystems will do in those conditions. So our future climate scenarios are here on the right. I am so sorry, I'm borrowing this slide from a presentation to our principal investigators, so it's dense. But our future climate scenarios that we're expecting, everyone's aware of drought, right? We're all very aware that things are expected to get drier over time. So along this drought index on the left-hand side, that's the lower window here, is a drier overall average over the long span of time. And then on the right-hand side, this is a less intuitive, less expected climate scenario, which has been well supported in the data. And that's that over time, we expect more variation from year to year in that rainfall. And so not only, let's look at this lower right now. So not only is the average going down, but the year-to-year variation is higher. And so a year like this, I think a lot of people take as, oh, maybe there's not a drought. This is what higher variation looks like in drought. This is simply a higher variance year within a lower mean precipitation trend. So when you average it out over time, overall, the rain that's falling is less, but from year to year, it can be a very, very wet year and a very, very dry year right next to each other, for example. So for the people with biology backgrounds on the left, there's a little bit of empirical observation, which is that we are seeing the mean decrease. We're seeing more extreme events that are coming one by one, for example, a severe drought or extreme flooding. And then we're seeing between years intra-annual variance. And I'll just sum up this lower left as there's a lot of theory as to what biology, ecological systems are going to do in response to these changes. And the jury's still kind of out on what's going to happen under these conditions. So the reason that we're not sure is because we expect that lower mean and increased variance interacting with each other, so simultaneously acting on the system, will have larger ecological impacts than drought alone or than changes from year to year alone. So there have been studies done looking at decreased means, so drought, and increased variance. So, year to year changes, wet, dry years. But this is the first experiment in the world that's looked at both at the same time. And I'll just sort of sum it up as we have some control plots. We have some plots that are just droughted. We have some plots that are just more variable, and we have some plots that are droughted and more variable. And we achieve this by collecting rain off of one plot, which in the figure is the plot on the right. It goes into the barrel in the middle and then gets pumped onto its paired plot. It's like wet year plot in real time during the storm. So this is just an awesome experiment. And we have tons of studies that are going on under these drought shelters. So these are intended to run very long term over the course of 18 years. We've built them one by one, 5 sites in the 5 ecosystems that I mentioned earlier. So Great Plains grassland, Chihuahuan Desert grassland, Chihuahuan Desert shrubland, Pino and juniper woodland, and juniper savanna. And each of those sites will run for 18 years. We'll take them down one by one, just like we put them up. So in these plots, we're monitoring what the plants are doing. We're monitoring what the cryptobiotic soil is doing. We're testing whether seeds can germinate and survive. We're testing whether seedlings of different species can survive. And then we're monitoring foundation species within those plots, which are species like plants that are very important to the ecosystem and that sort of define them. So we're intending to see what sort of ecosystem change we're expecting in the future from those plots. What I would like everyone to take away is that precipitation is expected to simultaneously become more variable and to also decrease in general over time. So don't let the wet years fool you. We should really be vigilant and know that over time the mean is still decreasing. And so some things that are viable now may need water in the future. Some of the plants that you're planting now might need supplemental water in the future. And then also the combination of these effects or of these drivers has different effects than just drought or variability alone. And we have yet to see what exactly those effects are. This is a really cool project, but I'm going to skip it because we were talking about nitrogen and I'm almost out of time. So we have an experiment where we're adding nitrogen yearly in the summer, and it's in the form of a typical fertilizer. And the intention of this is to simulate the extremes of natural deposition, either from the atmosphere or from agricultural runoff, which I think is common. This is particularly relevant for Candelaria because I would expect there to be a higher level of nitrogen in your soils than in natural bosque soils. So what we found from this study is actually very interesting. So on the one hand, the added nitrogen increases the total biomass of tumbleweed on the landscape. It's also, the tumbleweed is also dependent on how much bare ground there is to begin with. If there's more grass, then there's less tumbleweed. That's the basic conclusion of that. But then also, we've seen over time this transition from blue grama to black grama. And we've noticed that in the nitrogen addition plots, that competition, that out competition of black grama over blue grama is lessened by nitrogen addition. So just be aware that because of the availability of nitrogen in your soils, you might not see exactly what you expect to come up in terms of a fallow field or in terms of just a dirt lot that you would see around town. It might be very different. All right, we've got 4 minutes left. I want to tell you all that you're very welcome to check out our supplementary materials. You can listen to Other Boring Scientists every Friday from August 23rd to December 6th. We have our schedule published here. I would like to send out the slides afterward. I feel like it's a lot to cover. But we have links to the talk schedule here, as well as the Zoom link is included in there.
Could
And
you
then,
pop that talk schedule link in the group chat?
yeah,
Okay, thanks.
yeah, let me pull that up.
Sometimes if you hover on it, you can just like command click it and copy the link.
Yep. All right. So I'll put that in the chat here. It's just a Google Doc, and we're still finding our presenters for the semester. But it'll be great. It's always a showcase of the research that we're doing. We have some community talks that are centered around safety and how we're going to treat each other better. But for the most part, it's science-based. We'll have an overview of our data sets on August 23rd, which will be very similar to this presentation, but a little bit more in depth. And then we have presentations as well from grad students who are working with us. Our website link is here. That's sevlter.unm.edu.
I just popped it in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you. So if you come here, you can learn more about what we're doing, about the people who work with us. We do have a page for our BEMP partnership. There's information about our monitoring, our experiments, and our models, list to our publications, list to our data, and then just auxiliary information about the refuge and about what we're doing there. So this is a really great place to learn about what we're trying to do with our program. Also, something I almost forgot that I put this in here. We have live daily imagery under long-term monitoring phenocams. So every day, these images are loaded new live from the refuge. We have several projects that have cameras, and they're hooked up to a wireless repeater. So they send images twice a day to a server. These are used for all kinds of cool reasons. There's imagery analysis for how green the landscape is and how quickly things are growing. You can determine all kinds of things from these images. It's very cool. But if you just want to see what it looks like today, see if it's raining down there, you totally can, just by looking at that phenocam page. We also have upcoming events listed there, and detailed descriptions, as I mentioned before. If anyone from the Friends of Candelaria Nature Preserve is interested, it's in our permit to host tours and to educate groups. So if there's any interest at all of seeing what this landscape looks like, or seeing what our research looks like, what our experiments are, what the ecosystem transition zones are like, it's very doable. Just contact me and we can set something up. There's also our refuge visitor center, which is at exit 169 off of I-25. That's probably right where Astrid was driving by. It has a sign for the Sevilleta. And then this is very cool. On August 10th, the Amigos de la Sevilleta are having their yearly butterfly count that they've done for 8 years. So if you show up at 9, you can go with a friend of the Sevilleta to go to a site and just count what butterflies are out there. So cool. It looks like Augusta is interested in the tour.
I would love to ask you, can I ask you a question now? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. Should I keep the screen share up?
Whatever you'd like. I'm curious about, I saw on your website that there is a bunch of research being done, or is it being done on the archaeological finds that you have there? I'm sure there's lots out there. So I'm curious a little bit about that. Are you working with the Office of Archaeological Studies? Do you have archaeologists on site? How are you protecting the archaeological sites? That's question one. Question two, for those of us who have always wanted to go out to Ladrone Peak, is that open for us to go hike on there?
Yeah. So in order, I'd like to exit
Sure.
out of the screen share.
You know how to do that? You just go to click that share button at the bottom and well, there should be a red end share at the bottom of your screen somewhere. If you click on the Zoom.
hmm.
Andrew, you're the host. Can you help end Missy's sharing? I had to make Andrew the host because my internet's a little weak at my house.
Well, I can start just talking with this in the background. So the original question was on the ancestral importance of the Sevilleta.
Yeah.
So there's a very rich history here. Back far, it was ancestral lands of the Apache as well as the Piro-Monsatiwa group. And there are ancestral sites on the refuge. There are petroglyphs. There are a couple of stone outbuildings. After that period, this area was La Jolla Spanish land grant. So this is it just sort of covers like the classic story of New Mexico, right? There's this historical presence of people, pre-colonization, and then there's this Spanish land grant. There was a town that was centered in the current town of La Jolla, but then the lands outside that became the refuge were their communally shared lands. And so there's a history out there of more recent Spanish history. And then after that, the land was ranched by an Anglo family. It was General Campbell and his family ran it before ceding it, or well, not ceding it, but General Campbell put the land in his will. to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so there's a very long, rich history on this land, and I'm really glad that you asked about it. So we work with Fish and Wildlife for our permitting. And before any sort of site goes up, before there's any sort of ground disturbance, a archaeologist from Fish and Wildlife comes to clear the area to determine that there's no sites of historical importance. And we won't start work until it's cleared. And then our researchers are also trained in recognition of archaeological resources, cultural resources, and we're required by law to report if we find any of these in our research sites or around them. So our relationship to that research into the history is very limited. That falls more on the Fish and Wildlife side of the refuge management. But there have been several studies done that are collaborations between Fish and Wildlife and the UNM Archaeological Department.
That's good to know. Yeah, that's cool. And presumably you've had some interaction with the Puro Manso Tewa tribal historians. I might recommend them for him, actually, Diego Medina, for
Diego, yeah.
for your speaker series, because he's so interesting to listen to. I guess I guess I had a second question about Ladrone Peak. Is Ladrone the mountain? Just maybe somebody else on our call has already been there too, but is it worth it? It's always been a place I've been really curious about, and it just seems so hard to get to.
Is it worth it? Is like maybe a question I'm not qualified to answer. But I'm pulling up the map here. Where? Oh, that's El Paso.
Yeah, you're in El Paso.
I wonder why. Okay, so here's the refuge. Our domain, if you will, spans from Los Pinos. We cover most of Los Pinos. There's a little bit of Bureau of Land Management land over here that's open to the public at all times. That's a really great place. It's pinyon juniper woodland, and it's beautiful. Honestly, it's a nice place to spend some time. That's right over here off of Highway 60, and then Ladrone Wilderness Study Area. Actually, we got kicked out of a research project that was like right here. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah, we sure can.
Okay. So we had a Met station right here, a meteorological station that they said we can't maintain that road anymore because it's a wilderness study area. So gotta get out of here. And we moved it over here. But so really only this area is Sevilleta Wildlife Refuge. If you did want to see Ladrone, you can take this road. This is the exit for Bernardo. And if you come out this way, there's more roads than this that are available to go down there to track. This is mostly like cholla in this area, and then it gets up into juniper and then pinyon juniper. And then I hear that at the top of Ladrone, it's mixed conifer, so probably like ponderosa and maybe Douglas fir.
Yeah.
And I've only heard a couple of really crazy people who hiked up there. To my knowledge, there's not really a trail, and you kind of have to like bushwhack your way up. I've never gone higher than our previous Met station, which was probably around here. But worth it, I'm sure.
You haven't found the cave filled with all the loot? That's like
The
the
from
rumor.
the thieves,
Yeah,
from
from the
los
thief. The
ladrones.
buried treasure. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew's reminding us there's buried treasure at the legend. So maybe it's worth the hike up for that. Do we have any other questions from the folks in the listening audience? Comments? Anything?
Oh, Jim Rhodes had a comment. The drum is very rugged without developed trails. Okay, so I was
Good physical
kind of
condition.
right. Yeah,
Thank you,
take lots of
Jim.
time.
Not for wimps. That's, you can tell. You can tell.
Yeah, that's the conclusion, right?
Well, Missy, thank you so much for presenting to us today. We sure learned a lot from you, and I appreciate you so much patiently going through all the different ways that you're studying this. We've all been curious about Sevilleta because it's just such a it's just such it's so huge. It just seems like a monumental undertaking to really observe all of it. But I'm really fascinated. So many of us skip over it and go right down to the Bosque del Apache, and you're helping us remember not to do that. So thank you so much, Missy, for being with us at this talk. I want to let folks know that next month we will have we are all scheduled to be with John Jahadi. He is a Pueblo educator. He currently is up at Crow Canyon and Archaeological Center up in Southern Colorado, but he is from here, and he was a longtime educator at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. And we've asked him to talk about that very topic I brought up a little bit, which is the historic use of the preserve. He'll probably go into a wider use of the Albuquerque riparian area. It's a fascinating story if you don't know it. So I urge you to come next month, and we'll have that information out soon. Thank you so much, Missy, for being with us. Thanks. We appreciated you.
Thank you. Yeah, my email is in the original invitation for the talk. So if you have any follow-up questions, or if you maybe would like to know more about a protocol for a type of research that you found interesting in the presentation, I'm so happy to talk more.
I will pop it in the chat right now for everybody, your email. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you.